Thank you for the introduction. Let me start to thank the Falah coordinators and conference organizers for this fabulous conference and for letting me speak today. And so let me briefly introduce myself. I'm an environmental anthropologist, and I've been working in French Polynesia since 2018, mainly on reef fisheries, and we'll focus on this. So mainly, we're not going to talk about food a lot, even though fish for Polynesian populations is food, equates food, as Gilbert mentioned. Talk a lot about knowledge co-construction. So I'll make a brief definition of what I understand by knowledge co-construction, a process through which different bodies of knowledge are mobilized and weaved into the framing of problems and questions, the design of research protocols, the production of data, and the interpretation of analysis of data. So it's quite different from citizen science because it's trying to really integrate different bodies of knowledge in producing new information. The argument of the paper is that rahui, or time-bound closures, offer a unique opportunity that paved the way towards such processes. So I'll start off, and Gilbert sort of stole my thunder, try to describe what rahui is. So like most Polynesian names, so rahui is an ancient concept found across Polynesia, have several meanings. The first one is a territorial unit from mountain ridge to reef crest. The second is an institution that instaurs a temporary ban over resources or activities. It could be land-based, it could be land-based or marine-based. And another meaning that has been way less touched upon by colleagues. Excuse me. Yeah, okay. That has been way less touched upon, and that I realized talking with elders, when I would ask them what is rahui for them, they would turn around, not look at the sea, but go on the mountainside, show a mango tree, which is an introduced species, and say, this is rahui. It has a season where it provides and a season where it doesn't provide, okay? Which is quite interesting when you think about it when transposing it to marine resources, and I'll get back to that later. So one of the meaning is the generative forces that are embedded into resources. It's a bit philosophical, but I'll get onto it later. Okay, I've lost control over the... Okay. We've talked about tradition. As an anthropologist, we're very skeptical about the notion. The idea is that rahui is not an out-of-time concept that is taken from the past and applied in the present. It has gone through the transformations of local societies. It has gone through Christian transformations with the Christian missionaries in French Polynesia using new tools, the To'ohitu, which is a committee of wise people that were involved in decision-making, and it was a way to undermine the noblemen that had decision over rahui, okay? Rahui were set up by nobles. It was a very hierarchical society. Also, the French colonial administration started banning rahui in certain areas, in the Society Islands, for instance, and instrumentalizing it in other islands, in the atolls, where rahui was used to optimize copra production, displacing populations around the atoll to optimize copra production. And so a lot of people in the atolls, in the Tuamotus nowadays, do not want to hear about rahui because it reminds pretty bad memories. The important thing is that rahui is not, as Gilbert mentioned, is not a conservation ethic, all right? It's an optimization of production for social and political purposes, at least in the past. The idea was to align natural cycles to social cycles. So this idea of trying to weave in these different types of cycles, and even though it's a very fluid concept, I think the main common root is that it's time-bound. It's not permanent, it's temporary, time-bound. And this is important because it comes in contradiction with the credo of current marine management, which is MPAs are the best way to manage marine resources. You know this probably better than I do, but I love this comparison. Same author, same paper, 24 years apart, 78, Johannes predicted the disappearance of traditional or customary marine forms of management. 24 years later, same journal, I was wrong, and we are assisting to a rebirth of customary resource management initiatives. Why? I'll go quickly on this, but there's an international push since '92 to find community-based, bottom-up initiatives for resource management. Locally in French Polynesia, a cultural revival, people willing to revalorize their culture. And rahui appears like a godsend. Wow, people used to conserve the resource and this is perfect for what we want to do and implement community-based resource management. What I'm going to talk about today is not really fully community-based resource management. We do have a couple cases in French Polynesia, such in Rapa, Maiao, that have systems that are totally community-based, no intervention of the state of French Polynesia. But today we're going to talk about co-managed or hybrid initiatives, and these are frameworks, rahui, that are based on legal frameworks of the French Polynesian administration, either fisheries or environmental agencies. And so they are hybrid in the sense that they use a traditional concept and apply it with contemporary legal frameworks. They are managed by diverse steering committees that have different stakeholder compositions. And what's really interesting is that you have people in the same steering committee for most of the rahuis we're going to talk about that come from very diverse backgrounds. You have environmental activists, you have fishers, you have school teachers, you have church representatives, and they don't have the same goals. And how do you manage an area when you don't have the same goals? We'll go over that. So I'm going to present a bit of the emergence of the different new and hybrid rahuis in French Polynesia. So bear with me, it's going to go a bit fast. And take a look at the square here where you see how these rahuis have spread over the island of Tahiti. So the first really new rahui was created in Teahupo, that all of you know for the surfing, I imagine. Originally, it was closed for 3 years, this area, and it is still closed today because people have renewed it time on and time on. 2018, 4 years later, we have on the other side of Tahiti Iti, the community of Tautira that sets up a really innovative design with a permanent zone in the middle and 2 buffer zones that were supposed to open alternatively. The 3 zones were closed for 4 years, and the idea was in 2022 to open alternatively for relatively long periods of time the buffer zones. So the idea was really to try to link production issues and conservation issues. The idea was to promote sustainable fisheries rather than preserving an ecosystem. Going now on Tahiti Nui, we have 2 communities, Mateia and Papara, that set up a rahui on the same lagoon, which is quite unique to have 2 different municipalities work together for 2 years. 2 years later, one community decides to open up under pressure of the fishers. So they totally open the rahui for fishing. The other one keeps it, creates a bit of tension. And the opening of Mateia was considered a disaster because all of the accumulated biomass in 2 years was gone in 3 weeks. So media talked about total failure, even though it was a social success because fishers were still on board with the municipality and it avoided huge social conflicts. What happens, Tautira sees what happened in Mateia and is totally freaked out. Okay, so when they are supposed to open 4 years later, their 2 buffer zones I mentioned, you remember this alternate, they do a very timid and shy opening, 2 days of opening before reclosing 4 years because they were so afraid to lose all the effects of the rahui. Obviously created a bit of tension with the fishers, but also created interesting dynamics because fishers were able to see the results of the rahui because they were able to fish in it for 2 days. Same thing, Papara that I mentioned earlier, also very frightened, very timid opening, 2 days, allowing fishers to come and to go fishing in the rahuis. Tautira is reassured also. It was supposed to close for 4 years, but now they're going to open in a couple of weeks because they realize that, oh, this is working. The openings are working pretty well. What I want to mention with this, and the main point I want to make, is because these initiatives are time-bound, they have an expiry date, it allows for co-learning among communities, right? They see what the others are doing, they try to adjust what they're doing, and there's very hard decisions to make. When should we open? How long should we open? How should we manage the opening? And this invites collaboration with scientists because fishers are eager to learn, what can scientists help us understand, how long we should open, and so on. And this is what I'm going to talk about, is how these time-bound closures, when you open, you create a bubble where fishers can interact with administration, scientists, where poachers can interact with fishers that are for the rahui. We have a good picture here. I'm not going to tell you who's the poacher, but they are discussing together. You don't have this in an MPA because you don't have these moments, these social events of openings where people can come together and discuss values. And we've talked a lot about values. Managing resources is not a technical problem. It's a problem around values and objectives. So time-bound closures allow for this constant dialogue about values, benefits, what are we protecting, who are we protecting for. And as I mentioned, and this is what I'm going to focus on, a fertile ground for innovative knowledge co-production dynamics. So I'm going to show you a couple of initiatives we've been leading in French Polynesia to try to weave together scientific and local knowledge, especially in Moorea, where it's been really tense over the years between scientists and fishers. So several workshops where we brought scientists, marine biologists together with fishers to discuss, how do we count fish? How do we know that the resource is abundant in the lagoon and so on? And we have a good example here of a PhD student from the University of California who had a protocol for looking at herbivory in the lagoon. So this is caricatural, as Gilbert mentioned, but basically the results without fisher input. So she did her surveys, set up her assays in different parts of the lagoon. Results, no herbivory. But Dana spent some time with fishers that were like, come on, there's plenty of herbivores in our lagoon. And so she said, okay, I'm going to take fisher input to choose the sites where I carry out these herbivory assays. And her results were totally different, obviously, because she included fishers in selecting the sites where herbivory for selecting the assays. Another example of knowledge co-production systems. Sorry about that. All right. This is a classic figure, scientific figure of roadside sails in French Polynesia, Moorea, looking at different families of fish and how they evolve on the roadside sails. The main results are it's a bit fuzzy, but it's unicorn fish in 5 years, totally disappearing from roadside sails. Marine biologists are like, normal. There's no more unicorn fish in the lagoon. That's kind of the first interpretation. When we show this graph to fishers, so I'm talking about how you bring people into the interpretation of data too, they're like, yeah, there is less unicorn fish, but also we no longer sell it on the roadside, we sell it through orders and not through the roadside. So evidently, without fisher input, we would have a bad understanding. Obviously, it's a bit of both. The resource is declining, customers love that fish, so they no longer go to the roadside, they order it before. So it's kind of both interpretations work together. All right, another initiative we've talked about minimum sizes, especially input in Tautira. We had a great talk from Lyndon yesterday in the Solomon Islands and the importance on working on minimum sizes. We have a PhD student, Polynesian PhD student, Margarita Yarui, working on that. And the idea was, well, we're gonna select the species together with the fishers. What are the species that you want us to work on? And so there was a whole dynamic of co-production of selecting the species. And then in the design also was very important of training fishers to do the job. And also this species here, a grouper, well, fishers told Marguerite, your sampling design is fun, it's nice, 100 fish per month. They said, the problem is this fish species spawns in February, March. So if you sample it in June, the gonads are gonna be super small, and then you're gonna say they're immature, and it's not gonna be the case. So she changed her research protocol to integrate local knowledge. Fish counts are also a big question of interest. Fishers often do not trust fish counts done by scientists. They say, you count at the wrong hours, the wrong times, the wrong places, and we don't trust your data when you say we don't have any more fish in our lagoons. So the idea is to co-construct fish count methods with fishers that may integrate fisher knowledge, and we tried this during an opening of a rohui. And so we took fisher input, changed the time of day where fish counts were done. Marine biologists have logistical constraints. They go fish counting between 10 to 16, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. because it's easy to do, the boats are available and so on. But fishers fish from 6 to 8 in the morning and late in the afternoon. We tried fish counts at these different hours, and we see much more different species at these different times of day. And then also fishers said you should be counting in the passes rather than the back reef because that's where you see the important fish. And so same thing we showed with fisher input that in passes you're more likely to see the most prized fish species by fishers. Okay, so I made the argument, thank you. I made the argument that there is a possibility a bit, which is a bit different when Jabal said early, to sort of have scientists and fishers talk but it's usually on very factual data. Empirical data, you could get a marine biologist and a fisher, and they can talk for hours on their observation, facts, and kind of agree at some point. But I wanted to show you this figure. This is a figure of fishing intensity, yellow being high intensity. Which areas do you protect? I'll give you a minute just to think. When you show it to marine biologists, they're like, well, easy. High fishing pressure, highly vulnerable. This is where we need to protect. Show the fishers, they're like, no fishing here, why? There's no fish. This is a degraded area. This is where we need to put the rahui, okay? And obviously, they also have in mind that the only problem with the area is not only fishing, but also terrestrial runoff and so on. And so my last slide is, even though scientists and local fisher can agree, discuss on very factual data, are the epistemologies, the philosophies that Gilbert showed, that gray square in his presentation, are they commensurable? And a quick example. So what do fish counts do? Fishers, they swim, fish counters swim, take a snapshot of the fish they see, they count them, and they assess densities in a given place. They say, in this place, at this time, there is 50 fish per square kilometer, or per square meter. Fishers are like, well, this doesn't make sense. They focus on movement, how fish move in the lagoon. So you can't say that in one area you have a density of fish. It's all about time, lunar cycle, season, and that's what interests fishers, and that's what they target. What does this produce? Densities. Then it produces an evening out, a smoothing out of the lagoon, trying to do heat maps, right? Okay, we have densities here, here, here. We extrapolate, and we try to smooth out average in the lagoon. This is a map from a fisher, and it's the total opposite. It's nuts. I mean, they're looking for maximizing variation, understanding what habitats are, not even habitats, what rock, what coral is very different from each other. So there's this really different idea of you can't smooth out a lagoon because we're looking for all the differences in these lagoons. And lastly, the notion of abundance is really important. Abundance for marine biologists could be considered as an external parameter at a given time and point. You can try to estimate abundance. For fishers, abundance is not an exogenous parameter. It's a result of driving very diverse forces between fisher skill, behavior. A fisher that behaves badly in the ocean, like yelling and shouting, is not going to have fish because if the fish is going to go away, it's not going to be abundant. About fish behavior and movement, and also about spiritual entities and the relations of humans to these spiritual entities that may affect the abundance of fish. So an argument is that, well, fishers and scientists can talk a lot on empirical facts, but if they don't acknowledge the different epistemologies, the different radio transmitters Gilbert was talking about, you can come to a clash at some point because you don't really understand these differences. Thank you a lot. I'd like to thank all the contributors to this work, and sorry for delaying a bit my presentation.
Thank you very much for this interesting talk, showing a real experience of co-construction. Any question for Jean? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Referring back to your earlier slides, I really like the way you juxtapose optimizing fishing versus conservation. We talked a little bit about that after Gilbert's presentation. 2 days ago, talked a little bit about behavioral ecology. So it's more a comment than a question. I guess I can start with a question and then another comment. Did you mention, correct me if I'm wrong, that the colonial administration, when they had the plantations, in fact, encouraged rahui so that people could invest their time and effort on the plantations?
Yes,
okay.
The idea, because copra culture was introduced as an export cash crop,
okay.
And on atolls, the idea was to displace the village from sector or from a rahui to another, what they called a rahui. And so the whole villages were moved to actually a section that was called the rahui, but it was to exploit the coconut production.
Okay, so this is an example of the administration manipulating a so-called traditional technique or method. And finally, this is just a comment, and to stimulate debate. It kind of confirms in my mind that the idea of conservation, whether it's in the Pacific or elsewhere, is heavily inspired by a Western discourse, the idea that we're conserving resources. I'm based in Fiji, I've done work in Micronesia and so forth. I'm not saying that, as we mentioned earlier, that traditional knowledge is necessarily negative. Obviously, there are positive spins to it. The outcome could be very positive, for example. But if we look at optimization or maximization, you realize that perhaps people all over the world in time and space are actually aiming to maximize or optimize their short-term gains. This is very strange, but we're talking about future generations. Will there be a world for our children and grandchildren? And yet, I guess it's human nature that we're actually maximizing and optimizing maybe 1 or 2 generations down the road. I don't know. I'd like to just stimulate debate over that issue. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments. And so I think, yeah, it's really important to not confound intentions and outcomes, right? So the Rahui, the pre-colonial Rahui intentions were to maximize productions for social purposes, weddings, ceremonies, whichever, probably had beneficial conservation outcomes, but it was not the intention. A bit like domestication of crops, right? The first domestication of crops were not intended, but the outcome was, first agriculture is genetically modifying crops through their practices. Then on the sort of maximizing part, that's a huge question. And it depends. I think there might be, I don't know, but it's not always energy or protein or glucids that are maximized, but it could be social capital, social power. So that has to come into play too. And I mean, working in French Polynesia, I'm pretty surprised how unmaximizing some of the fishers are. When they have a really good fishing outing, so we GPS tracked 44 fishers, all of their fishing outings. When they have a really good catch, they lay low for a couple of days. They could, they could go back again and get a huge other, keep going. But it's more and more not, even though, I'm very familiar with the HBE literature and so on, and I do agree that there are some forms of maximization in our philosophies. I think humans are obsessed by fertility, whether human or crops or cattle or whatever, and then maximizing fertility. But it's not, it's not that simple. There are other things that are maximized also, like leisure, social capital, and so on. So it kind of makes that you need to tweak these models that are useful, I believe, because they bring new information and new hypotheses that can be tested with empirical data.
Thank you. Just a question. Sorry, this is more a comment. The hybrid concept, I really like that that model. I think for the Pacific and especially for Fiji, when we bring the science to the community level, it's hard for them to accept. They're not comfortable around the science, but it's more enhanced when you bring in the traditional knowledge. They feel a sense of ownership and connection to that knowledge, and they tend to be more involved. And it also helps in the success of that project overall. So I believe with local knowledge and local practices, it does enhance the science, especially at the community level, at the village level. Yeah, so that's an experience we've seen in Fiji. I just like to make that comment here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think that's spot on, because the idea is to create a two-way road. It's not like one way or the other. It's like local knowledge can definitely enhance scientific knowledge, and there's not enough of that. But also, scientific knowledge can bring things to local communities, because if a fisher goes to the fisheries department and say, "You're wrong, I see a lot of fish," they're just not going to listen. If they have a report with statistics and show the fisheries department that there is more fish than what experts are saying, then they'll listen. So bringing some methods of the scientific method to the communities is important, and I definitely agree, and this is what we try to do here. We now have Polynesian fishers that do the fish counts. And this is much more trust building than if a white and French dude like me comes to a community and says, "Oh, you don't have any more fish in your lagoon." But if you have like two fishers that are like, "Oh, we thought there was a lot of fish, we realized there aren't as much as then you have trust, and it's much more easier to build something.